Welcome to the official channel dedicated to Sheikh Hamdan, where emotions speak louder than words and where love stories unfold in the most majestic ways. Today's story takes you deep into the heart of royalty and romance, the best surprise ever for my queen. This isn't just a gift or a grand gesture, it's the culmination of love, trust, and months of secret planning for the woman who changed his world. Let's dive into a breathtaking script filled with warmth, elegance, and raw emotion. Sheikh Hamdan had always been a man of grace, mystery, and charm. Yet even with all the power and prestige he carried, there was one realm where he surrendered completely, the realm of love. She was calm in chaos, his muse in every poem, and the light that turned his silent days into symphonies. For her, he was ready to go beyond tradition, beyond royal protocol, to create a moment that she would remember for the rest of her life. He began the secret plan 6 months prior, away from the watchful eyes of the palace and press. Only his most trusted aides knew what he was orchestrating, a surprise that would melt her heart, crafted with every detail reflecting her personality. He wanted it to be more than diamonds, more than roses, he wanted it to speak directly to her soul. Something no queen had ever received before, a gift not of gold, but of thought, devotion, and pure emotion. The first clue was a handwritten letter, delivered to her pillow in the early morning hours. No royal seals, no assistants involved, just ink on parchment, written in his own hand, signed only with, "You're forever." It led her to the royal stables, where a white Arabian horse stood, wearing a silk ribbon and a saddle embroidered with poetry he had written for her long before she knew they were in love. But that was only the beginning. As she followed the trail, she discovered places within the palace grounds she had never seen, gardens she never knew existed, filled with lavender and jasmine, her two favorite scents. Every garden had a small note hanging on a tree, revealing a piece of his heart, his fears, his dreams, and his silent promises he had made to her long before he could say them aloud. As the sun began to set, the palace courtyard transformed into a dreamscape, hundreds of lanterns floating in a mirrored pool, a private orchestra playing the melody he composed just for her, and a canopy of roses hanging from above. The moment she stepped into that garden, time itself seemed to pause. There were no guards, no advisors, only him, standing in the center, dressed not in royal garments, but in simple white linen, with eyes full of longing. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding with disbelief and awe. This wasn't the usual grandeur of royal gestures. This was intimacy in its purest form. Before she could utter a word, he gently took her hand, kissed her fingers, and whispered, "I've built kingdoms, won races, and led nations, but loving you has been my greatest victory." Then came the final part of the surprise, a small velvet box, not for a ring, but for something far more symbolic. Inside was a gold-engraved key, a key to a private palace wing he had secretly built for her. It wasn't opulent, but poetic. A library filled with her favorite authors, a studio where she could paint without being watched, a sunroom with views of the desert sunrise, and a hidden rooftop garden where they could escape the world together. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that this wasn't just a surprise. It was a confession, a declaration that she wasn't just a queen by title. She was the queen of his heart, his sanctuary, and his forever. Every part of the palace wing whispered his love for her, in colors, in textures, in the silence that only they would understand. Then, as stars began to scatter the night sky, Sheikh Hamdan led her to a final space, a small cinema room with a screen already glowing. To her amazement, it began playing a short film made of real footage, clips of their earliest moments, secret smiles captured in reflections, hidden glances during public events, and voiceovers of his poetry narrated softly. It ended with the words, "Thank you for giving me a reason to become a better man. This is all for you, my queen." The orchestra resumed with a melody she had never heard, because it had been composed entirely from notes that symbolized her name in musical notation. As they danced, there were no reporters, no duties, no protocols. Just a man and a woman wrapped in a love so divine, it needed no crown to be royal. The following morning, whispers began to circulate across the palace and the city. But no one truly knew what had occurred. It wasn't meant for the world, it was meant for the woman who changed his universe. He didn't do it for attention, he did it to honor love in its most honest form. Sheikh Hamdan, known to the world as a leader and poet, had finally outdone even his most iconic words. For in that one night, He showed the world that the greatest poetry is not written, it is lived, felt, and gifted to someone who truly deserves it. And for her, he would continue writing that love story, one surprise at a time. The next morning was unlike any other. The sun broke through the palace windows with a golden tenderness, as if even nature itself understood that something extraordinary had happened. The entire palace seemed quieter, softer, as though it too were holding its breath, trying not to disturb the afterglow of the most beautiful night Sheikh Hamdan had ever orchestrated. She woke up in her private wing, her fingers tracing the edges of the velvet box still beside her on the bed, and the golden key inside. For the first time, royalty felt like home, not a cage of expectations, but a kingdom of love. She walked barefoot through the space he had designed, her heart overwhelmed by the depth of his thoughtfulness. The studio was filled with blank canvases, new brushes, and oils he had imported from Italy, because months ago she once mentioned she missed the texture of real pigments. In the library, her favorite poetry books were marked with delicate bookmarks, and each page had a note he'd written, commenting on her favorite lines. He had not only listened, he remembered, cherished, and turned her words into action. Meanwhile, Sheikh Hamdan stood on the rooftop garden, watching the horizon with a peaceful smile on his face. His brothers had begun to hear whispers of the surprise, but no one dared to question it. They knew that for the first time in years, Hamdan was not fulfilling duty, he was fulfilling his heart. He wasn't just a crown prince that day. He was a man in love, fully and deeply, and unapologetically so. Even the royal advisors, who once raised their brows at his secrecy, now stepped back in quiet reverence. Later that afternoon, he invited her to a hidden chamber within the palace walls, one even his parents rarely visited. It was the royal gallery, where portraits of past rulers and their spouses were displayed. But one frame stood covered. Sheikh Hamdan pulled the cloth away gently, revealing a majestic painting of her, not in royal robes, but in the dress she wore when they first met in private. The painting radiated with light and warmth, painted by one of the kingdom's most gifted but reclusive artists. And beneath the frame, a gold plaque read, "The Queen who reigned over my heart." She gasped in awe, her fingers trembling. To be placed among royal legacy was one thing. But to be immortalized in a moment of intimacy, in the version of herself she never thought the world would honor, that was a different kind of recognition. It wasn't about status or appearance. It was about identity. About how deeply he saw her. And it made her fall in love with him all over again. Later, as they sat under the golden archways of the royal courtyard sipping tea, he shared the final part of the surprise, his personal journal. A deep leather-bound book, filled with entries going back 3 years, written every time she smiled, cried, laughed, or simply existed in his presence. Each page was a story. Each word was a confession. She flipped through it, stunned to find poems she had never read, feelings he had never spoken aloud, and pages titled with dates she thought he had forgotten. But he hadn't. He remembered it all, because she was unforgettable to him. Tears quietly slipped down her cheeks. She asked him softly, "Why me? You could have had anyone in the world." Sheikh Hamdan took her hand, placed it over his heart, and said, "Because only you made this beat like it wasn't trapped in tradition. Only you made me believe I didn't need to be perfect, I just needed to be real." Those words became etched into her very being. Because in a palace full of expectations, being real was the rarest treasure of all. They spent the rest of the day in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because sometimes the deepest emotions require no voice. The palace staff moved quietly, sensing the sanctity of the moment. For once, the palace wasn't bustling with meetings or formalities. It pulsed with the rhythm of two souls finally aligning in perfect harmony. That evening, Sheikh Hamdan arranged one last surprise, not grand or loud, but deeply symbolic. A royal falcon, known as the symbol of strength and pride in Emirati tradition, was released into the sky from the palace tower. Attached to its leg was a small scroll, flying toward the northern winds. She looked at him in confusion, and he explained gently, "In our family, we send messages to the ancestors this way. I wrote to them, to tell them I found her." Her breath caught in her throat. The gravity of what he just said wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. This was spiritual. He was introducing her to generations past, claiming her not only in this lifetime, but in the legacy of those who came before him. It was a vow that no document or crown could match. And she knew then, she wasn't just loved. She was chosen. As the stars lit up the night sky again, he held her close and whispered, "You are the poetry I couldn't write until I met you." She closed her eyes, leaning into him, thinking of all the women who dreamt of fairy tales and kings. But this wasn't a fantasy. It was real. It was raw. And it was hers. The next morning, the world resumed. The city buzzed. The press speculated. But she remained tucked in the palace wing that love had built. And every time she opened a drawer, a new note waited for her, because Sheikh Hamdan had hidden 365 messages, one for each day of the year. Some were romantic, some funny, some tearful. But all were true. And each one reminded her, she was never alone. To the world, he was Sheikh Hamdan, the ruler, the poet, the horseman, the future king. But to her, he was something much greater. He was the man who turned love into a lifelong surprise, who made a queen out of a woman he simply refused to let go. And in his arms, she found the kind of forever that only few ever get to live.